Welcome to Inside Admission, the podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at the college admission process with the experts in and around college admission. Welcome to the Inside Admission podcast. I'm your host, Andy Palumbo, and I am very excited to bring you a special edition, our first ever. What's a special edition? I don't know. I made it up. But in January, late January, the College Board made an announcement about the digital SAT, moving from the world of pencil and paper to the exciting world of computers. And no, it's not 2004. It is 2022. Don't try to adjust your YouTube. But as I was sort of grappling with that news, and I was talking to some folks who are colleagues, folks in the media, and as I sat down at home and was looking at my Twitter feed, I just saw so many people asking a fundamental question: what does this mean? And so as I was sitting there, I fired off an email to three experts, a school counselor, a testing expert, and one of my peers in college admissions and enrollment. And I just, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could just have a talk about this, do a special edition of the podcast and just try to explain to students and parents what this means, what's changing, what's not. And to my surprise, all three said yes, and we were able to coordinate some busy calendars. And I am thrilled to bring you this special edition on the digital SAT and standardized testing in general. And so I'd like to move into introductions of today's guests. Alicia, why don't you start off? Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Andrew. So my name is Alicia Oglesby. I am a high school counselor in a public high school in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And so I have been a high school counselor and a college counselor, some variation of the two, for the past 9 years. And prior to my role at this school, I was also a site coordinator for the SAT and PSAT and AP exams at my former high school. So lots to share on that.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, Alicia. Akil, some of our listeners and viewers may know you as the father of the Netflix and Broadway star, Akil Bello. And they may be surprised to know that Alexander's father also has some interesting skills and talents. And so why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and brag about your son for a minute.
Oh, thank you. I am not as talented as my children, but I try to keep up. My greatest talent is filling in little bubbles, and I've been doing that for 30 years. So I've been a test prep tutor, a test prep company owner, everything you could imagine in the test prep world for 30 years. And I don't know, about 5-6 years ago, I sort of flipped to the other side and started doing more work along testing policy, admissions policy, testing research. I currently work at Fair Test. So the way I like to put it is my full-time job is making my more lucrative part-time job go away.
That's great. That's great.
I love it.
And so people know what I'm ribbing you about a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your son and his more recent brushes with fame.
I have two sons, one of whom is a high school 10th grader, so that's fun because I'm on the mailing list. I haven't gotten anything from WPI or Bates yet, but when I do, I'm gonna let y'all know. My younger son is an actor, and he's been doing some kind of cool things of late. He was in on Netflix, John Mulaney and the Sack Lunch Bunch. He just did the Tap Dance Kid on Broadway, so he's done a few things, which is kind of cool. So,
that's great. Thanks for sharing,
I'm a
Akil.
stage
Thanks
dad
for
too, apparently.
Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, Lee, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your institution and maybe your institution's history with standardized testing.
Awesome. Well, yeah, as Alicia and Akil both said, thank you, Andrew, for inviting us. I was super psyched to get this invitation where I too was like, what does this mean? So selfishly, this is an opportunity to be with Alicia and Akil and hear from them and their perspectives. But yes, so I'm Lee Weisenberger. I'm VP for Enrollment and Dean of Admission and Financial Aid at Bates College, which is a liberal arts college in Lewiston, Maine. I have been here wildly so for 17 years. So had what tends to be kind of classic in college admission, like, oh, I'll do this job after college for 2 years and then see what happens. And now I've been here for way more than 2 years. But to Andrew's point, I think Bates's longstanding history and really having been a leader and a pioneer in the test optional movement, I shouldn't say I think, I know, is exactly what attracted me to working at Bates, in that I didn't even know these types of colleges existed way back when I was applying, and having not been a stellar test taker, for whatever that means, a place like Bates would have been wonderful for me. So I very intentionally chose to work at an institution that didn't place a lot of value or emphasis on testing, having nearly 40 years ago determined that the tests aren't necessarily created equally, never mind opportunity or access to the tests or prep for the tests. It was something that just really spoke to me, and I thought I could represent the institution well. So I know we'll have further opportunity to get into the weeds there, but that's a little bit about the history of Bates vis-a-vis testing. So really just pleased to be here with you all today.
Enjoying the podcast? Like and subscribe to this YouTube video. You can also find us on the web at InsideAdmissionPodcast.com, and you can find and engage with us on social media, where our handle is Inside Admission on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Now, back to the pod. I will share just a little bit of my background. So I've worked at 4 different institutions in higher education. And when it comes to testing, my alma mater, Union College, I was there as an assistant dean of admissions when we opted to go test optional. Then at the Sage colleges, I was a part of taking that school test optional. And then I moved to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, Plymouth State University, a small public regional comprehensive university, and helped that institution adopt test optional admissions practices, which then led to the entire New Hampshire public university system adopting those policies. So really excited when my most recent role, I came to WPI, and they had already done the work back in 2007. They've been test optional since then. And so it's been a lot of fun to be at a place that was an earlier adopter, especially in the STEM realm, where sometimes people think, there's something incongruous about test optional policy in STEM. And we'll probably get into that somewhere during this conversation. But most recently this spring, WPI, I worked with our faculty to take the university test blind or test free. And so the university no longer uses standardized test scores for admissions and aid, whether a student would want us to or not. And so I think we have a great mix of backgrounds and experience and perspectives. And before we jump into the digital SAT, one of the things I do on my normal podcast, try to have a little bit of fun and show the human side of this work that we do, show we're not robots or algorithms, talk about our college admissions process. But for this special edition, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to talk about our standardized testing experience? Akil, you're going to have to pick like top 2 or 3. All right. We don't want to hear 30 years of taking the test. But I guess it's only fair if I kick us off. So as I was thinking about this, I don't remember a whole lot about standardized test scores. It's funny. Every once in a while, someone will ask me, "Oh, what did you get on the SAT?" And I'm like, I could not tell you. And I understand some people, it still means a lot, 20, 30, 40 years out, but I guess I'm just not one of those people. So I went to a small town, public school. The cows may have outnumbered the people in this town. And it was not like this, overwhelming achievement focus or test prep type of world. And so now that I'm in the admissions world, I've kind of been surprised at how high stress and anxiety ridden this process has become for many students. And I assume even knowing the profile of the high school that I went to, it probably is there now as well. And so that was not my experience. I think that the test prep that I got was my parents bought me some flashcards with some vocab words, which I think is the old SAT, if I'm getting the versions right. And I opened that pack and looked at them once. And then I just took the test. And it was funny because I was at a private Catholic school. And so I start getting to some of the difficult questions. And I look up for the clock like I always do in class. And there's Jesus on the cross, just staring at me. And I'm like, where's the clock? No clocks. Just Jesus staring at me. And the whole time I'm thinking, he's judging me. You should have read those cards. You should have studied for this test. And it's kind of ridiculous, but that is all I remember. I just remember looking for a clock and I could not find one. So obviously I was not super focused on the SAT when I went through the process, but it ended up working out for me just fine. And I guess my one thing I'd say to folks listening or watching is that is even more so the case today with so many schools that are test optional and test blind. And so, I think one of the things we're trying to get here today is to give you the information to tamp down some of that anxiety and some of that stress and give you, answers to some of the questions you might have. So, Alicia, why don't you share your experience with standardized testing?
Yeah, sure. I'm very similar to you. I don't really remember that much about it. I remember whatever my score was, I remember thinking it was close to whatever was the next level, like whether it was 1180 or 1280. I just remember thinking oh, I almost got this other score. So that's pretty much all that I can remember in terms of my score, but I do remember in terms of the test. So I went to a fairly diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse high school in Philly, huge high school, 2,000 students. There were 650 students in my senior class. And it was a magnet school. It was a special admissions school in Philly. So we had to take a test and write an essay and do all this to get in the first place. So I remember in ninth or 10th grade, when we took the PSAT, I thought to myself, this is ridiculous. I'm already at this school. Why isn't that enough? And so our teachers were having to explain the rationale of us taking this exam, because we were kind of, just not interested in doing things for the sake of doing things. And so, we had to get the explanation why. That was the philosophy of the school. Essentially, we were always questioning, because that's what they were telling us to do. They were telling us to always question. And so we're like, okay, why am I taking this test? And so I remember my very best friend, Erica, scored higher than me. I don't remember what she scored. She's still my best friend. But I remember kind of feeling some type of way about that. I'm like, we're in the same class. How did you get higher than me? She's like, oh no. She even did better on the GRE than I did. So yeah, ultimately it didn't really, I guess it mattered to some extent. I got into the schools that I applied to. I'm hoping that, it was, I don't know, I guess we'll discuss that later, but I'm hoping that it was because of my grades, because I worked really hard in my classes and I got pretty much straight A's since kindergarten. And my parents still have all my report cards from when I was little. Yeah, seriously, almost straight A's every single year of my life. So I was, since then, I've been a little anti standardized testing because I felt that I was working hard enough in the ways that I should have been. So that should have been enough for me. But ultimately, I did get to go to the college that I wanted to go to. So I was fortunate in that regard. And yeah, I'm here today to tell my story. I survived it and I'm doing wonderfully.
Thanks for sharing, Alicia. Lee, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you recall?
So I will offer I had a lot of anxiety about the test itself. I remember it vividly. I remember my scores vividly. And I remember all of the opportunities I was seeking and truly being deeply concerned that doors were closed based on how I performed. So, a little bit of background. Sounds like maybe I went to a similar high school as Andrew. I grew up in a really small town, 3,000 people. I went to a regional high school. There were 3 towns in my high school, and yet only 85 kids in my graduating class. I love my hometown to this day. I was just there. I loved my high school. I very intentionally chose to go to the public high school, which I had the privilege of making that choice. So I take a lot of pride in public education and my alma mater. Yet it was a bit of an interesting era in the those students who were doing quote unquote well didn't necessarily get a ton of attention because it was assumed they were on the right path and could be independent and persevere. No slight on my high school, and that when I did ask for help, I got it. However, I was a little afraid to because I thought I could figure it all out. So I remember not so much the flashcards, Andrew, but I remember the big test books that were like the newspaper paper, and they were like 2,000 pages, and you could take multiples. And I would go to like the town library, and I would bring that book with me. And then I'd end up like reading fashion magazines, just, truth be told, and like never actually took the practice test because I was just like, I'll be fine. I'm good in school, like Alicia, like I get great grades. And I'm a communicator. I'm not a bubble filler outer. So I just definitely, to this day, like my husband makes fun of me. I get anxiety if I'm filling out like a hospital survey after one of our kids' visits because I'm like, which bubble do I fill out? And I just start to second guess myself. So all of that to say, I knew I was entering the testing site with anxiety. And then the other piece, just thinking about this question, Andrew, again, maybe because I just grew up in such a small town, there was a lot of like social anxiety because our high school didn't offer the test. So we had to drive elsewhere, which again, in my little rural setting, like meant getting on 95, like making sure you weren't going to get stuck in New Haven traffic. So I'm revealing I grew up in Connecticut, having to go to a boarding school to take the tests. Where's the bathroom? Like, I know it all sounds trivial, but like, can I have a granola bar with me? Can I not? I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. So it just, it was not fun. I will admit too, I've had phenomenal professional opportunities, but at every juncture when I've thought about perhaps going to graduate school, my first thing has been, do they require the GRE? Because I don't think I want to go there. Because I don't know that I can handle it. So all that to say, I took the test twice. I didn't score as quote unquote well as I would have liked to. I got waitlisted at a number of institutions. I started off at a really large urban institution in New York. Not a good fit for me. And I ended up transferring to a single sex institution after a year and a half. That I'm not sure testing was required when I applied as a transfer, or maybe it was really diminished in terms of its value. Regardless, ultimately found my path, wouldn't regret it in any way, shape, or form, but my experience absolutely has informed my professional life, and also how I think about my own children's education and how we'll chart their path forward. So you just got all my baggage.
It's funny. Lee, you sharing that, I remember, where is the bathroom? I traveled from that small school and it's like very real social anxiety, like you talk about. And then I rewind and I think about, there were students trying to take this test during a global pandemic. It's so nuts. And I think that was such a motivator for schools to get their acts together and to adopt some more flexible testing policies. But I'm sure we'll get into that. But it just that resonated because I remember how stressful that was. And I can't even imagine what it's been like.
Can I say one other thing? Stop. I
Yeah.
also remember, so I was a 3-sport athlete and I had a job. And so the scheduling of it too was really worrisome, like, okay, do I have a game? Is my shift then? Yada, yada. So there's a lot baked into it that might not come across when you simply think, oh, the student got this test score.
And so now Akil, the man who has taken the SAT more
That's
times than maybe anyone. Why don't you share a little bit about your history with the test?
Officially as many times as you would think. But I will share a couple of tidbits. So one interesting thing is testing has opened a few. Oh, my first memory of testing is I was applying from public junior high to high school in a Catholic high school, and there was a test, and I scored well. I don't really know what that means. And the principal thought they were getting a scholar rather than a rebellious teen. And so I used his belief to get out of detentions my entire freshman year. so that's the one thing that's like my first memory of testing. And it wasn't really even about the test. It was just like his perception of me because of the test let me make excuses for all kinds of ridiculous shenanigans that shouldn't have been excused. And then a couple other things. I cheated on the SAT twice in high school for friends, but we got caught.
We're getting real.
That was fun. I actually paid $35 to get my SAT scores from high school. So if you're curious, Andrew, feel free to pay your $35 to College Board and get your scores. They were lower than I thought. I remember being told that I had good scores. My memory of it was I had good scores. And maybe in context they were good, but they were like solidly average when I actually got the numbers. And that is a fascinating thing to me, just perception of scores and what they mean, and in the end, they didn't mean a whole lot. I did my first year at the local college, which was open access. And then I transferred twice and got a degree. And, testing didn't really impact my college experience. But I did cheat on it twice, which is fun.
So, I think it's funny that the common theme seems to be, whether we stressed about it or not, or whatever happened,
Yes.
we all turned out okay. Life does go on. These tests are not as large as they may appear to you or your parents as you're approaching them. But let's talk about that, Alicia. That's a huge part of what you do is getting students and their families prepared for this process. So, tell us a little bit about the current landscape and how students are introduced to testing and what it looks like.
Yeah, so I can speak for probably most public schools in the country where many of us introduce the standardized testing process in ninth grade, essentially. So, with most public schools, students sort of move through. I'm in a small district, so students that go to the elementary school, go to the middle school, go to the high school. There isn't necessarily any of that process prior to ninth grade, but once they start ninth grade, we introduce them to the PSAT 8-9. And so, typically we don't try to make a big deal about it here at our school. Most schools where I've been, it's the school itself, administration, teachers try to do a good job of, de-escalating some of the ideas and thoughts about standardized testing. There's a lot of work that we do around addressing myths about standardized testing. No, colleges are not going to see your PSAT scores. No, you don't necessarily have to study for it in any particular way at this point in ninth and 10th grade. Yes, it does come with some implications in 11th grade with NMSQT. And so, depending on the high school where you are, we generally have merit finalists every single year. So we do need to emphasize that part of it. But yeah, we introduce it in ninth grade and the students are either freaked out about it, or they don't take it seriously. There isn't a ton of in between. If you've ever met teenagers, they tend to operate in extremes. So yeah, it's an arduous process that I think gradually gets more and more anxiety provoking. The higher the risk, I guess, that students associate with their score and doing well or not well. For the past 9 years, I've always, received questions about whether or not this is a good score, and really helping families and students understand the context of their scores,
Sure.
the context of their college wish list and all these sorts of things. But currently, I would say, um, there's just tons of anxiety in general. I mean, I've certainly seen an increase in the number of students who are being referred to my office, more than previous years for a number of concerns. I'm really concerned about the students who are confused about the process and confused about test optional and confused about whether or not to take it or whether or not to send their scores. And this is mostly current 11th graders. And, we have some very, very high functioning students. And so that comes along with, registering for all the AP classes, all the honors classes, and trying to squeeze in test prep, and sometimes not being able to afford that. So doing it on their own, it's a lot, especially for a lot of students who are really, really taking this process very seriously, and who are putting entirely too much emphasis on this exam because they think they have to, in order to achieve certain goals. And so I would say, currently this past school year, and I'm literally in the midst of meeting with a lot of 11th graders. I have meetings after this meeting. Students are anxious. They're anxious about what these scores mean. They're anxious about testing, getting to test centers. They're anxious about being able to test at all, depending on protocol for certain buildings. I've had a number of losses in the school community in terms of relatives, grandparents. Students are out for funerals. And so they're missing days, they're missing information. I mean, it's just, it's the perfect storm, to really cause a lot of anxiety, among students and parents who are learning the process. I think we forget sometimes because we do this work every day. Every year, it's new to them. Every class, it's new. This whole thing is pretty much new to them. I often ask in those sessions, do you have an older sibling? Because if the answer is no, then it's like I'm starting from the beginning, explaining what all of this means. So I think there's still a lot of confusion. I know there's a ton of anxiety.
Thanks, Alicia. And we're filming this on National School Counselor Week. So happy School Counselor Week, Alicia. But we have the balloon and everything to celebrate. So, but I'd be remiss, I'm happy that this podcast has been so popular with students and with families going through the process. Trying to share not really my expertise, but like the expertise of the smart people that I know in this world, with families. But it is no substitute for your school counselor, your college counselor. I mean, like, these are the experts who they do this year in, year out. And yes, they may be overworked and overwhelmed, but I have rarely met a school counselor who would let that stand in the way of the student who needs their help when they need it. And so the superheroes of this process, thank you, Alicia. And that is my plug, that if you're listening to this podcast, that's great, but you sure as heck should be listening to your school counselor way, way before you start listening to podcasts or going on parent Facebook groups, mom and dad. I heard.
That too.
So Facebook groups are the new water cooler.
Thank you. Oh, the new water cooler. No, no good can come of them. Very little good.
So, Akil, so you know this test really well, and I've joked about the many versions of the SAT over the past 20, 25 years. What does this version look like? Because I think many parents going through the process remember something that has not existed for a long time. And so, tell us a little bit about what it looks like now. What are the sections? What's the timing look like?
Sure. So, I mean, when you say this version, do you mean SAT 16.0 or do you mean SAT 15.0 or 15.3? Right? So, right. So, and right. Which one are we focusing on? Are we focusing on the new?
Not the new.
Okay.
We're gonna roll into that, but the one that students are taking
today,
this calendar year and through 2023 at least.
And I think that's really key for any family thinking about this stuff right now. What grade is your child in? And just setting a hard cutoff for conversations, right? I don't think 9th and 10th graders should be talking about, thinking about, or taking standardized tests right now, right? Actually not, well, wait. The U.S. class of 2020, in 2024 spring is when the new SAT will launch, which means it is for the graduating class of 2025. Am I correct, Alicia? Graduating classes mess me up. All right, so if the student is in the graduating class of 2025 or higher, forget all things testing, right? Like, because all of the current testing doesn't apply to them, right? That being said, for 11th graders and possibly some 12th graders right now and possibly some 10th graders next year who will potentially take the current SAT, which I call version 15.0 or some such thing, because there have been that many significant revisions. And I'm not talking about minor revisions. I'm talking about significant revisions since the test was started. So one of the things I actually just wrote an article for Forbes about the test. It was just funny to me to go like, we say the SAT, but there ain't really no the SAT. Right? Like there's no vocab on it like there was before. There's no need for flashcards that you're referencing. Right?
Yep.
The current SAT in the reading portion of it is all reading comprehension. And of that reading comprehension, which is about 52 questions, maybe 4, 5, 6 of them are vocabulary based from the passage. So the vocab is completely different from what most people my age remember, right? There are no analogies, none of that sort of stuff, right?
Yep.
So it's reading comprehension, and then there's grammar in the verbal component of the test, right? And if you're my age, you might remember the TSWE. Right? The TSWE has taken, at least like, do I know that? Like, it was the test of standard written English, which was on the SAT back in the late 80s. Then it was dropped off the SAT and became an SAT 2. Then it was put back on the SAT in a new form. So they just keep like rejiggering things and renaming it. It's like, to me, it's Coca-Cola. The SAT is essentially Coca-Cola. They just keep is it Coke One? Is it Coke Natural? Is it New Coke? Like it's all the same crap with a new name, rejiggered, slightly different kind of sugar, but the core of it remains fairly similar. It's some brown water that probably will kill you if you drink enough of it.
The SAT or Coke?
Coke. Probably the SAT as well. So the current SAT has reading comprehension, grammar, and then math. And even the math is different than what it was. The current math basically spans 9th. So early algebra 1 through algebra 2 with a sprinkling of geometry. There's no trig, there's no pre-cal, there's none of that sort of stuff, and there's never been any pre-cal on the SAT. So I laugh when STEM places are basically saying, if you're really good at fast addition, you're ready for calculus. Like that's kind of what using the SAT says. Like, it's like, because especially the older SAT, which spanned basically 6th grade through 10th grade math, right? And it would ask questions like, what's a multiple and what's a factor? These are things like you learned in 6th grade and then never revisited. So weird relationship, not irrelevant, but definitely weird relationship to performance in college level math, right? So the current SAT, reading comprehension, grammar, and basically 9th or 8th grade math through 10th or 11th grade math, right? For most people, with very, very little geometry. The old SAT had maybe 30% geometry. The 15.0 has about 5-6% geometry. So what it's testing has changed a whole lot. So I find it funny that we keep calling it the SAT, and it's basically saying any test with math and reading or English-y things, we can tag on the label SAT, and therefore it's the same as long as they keep some kind of 200 to 800 scale. Right? So,
well, to be fair, in some of the cheating scandals, it was the exact same test, right? So they just reused it, recycled it.
Well, sort of, yeah. Like, so, and there's a lot of questions around the reuse and the scaling and stuff like that. You get 53 out of 58 math questions right, your score could be different by 90 points with the same number of questions correct. Like, I don't care how much you want to talk about equating and all this fancy science testing terms they want to use. There is no world in which that should happen. Right. And then say that this is a standardized test. It's standardized.
So thank you for standardized ish. I like that. So thanks for sharing that, Akil. So I want to sort of pivot to the world of test optional and test blind. You know, Lee and I talked about that a little bit. But first, I just want to sort of segue from something that Akil joked about earlier, but the perception of tests and of scores. And I think that is so core to a lot of the misunderstandings and misuse of tests. To Akil's point, you know, WPI, when we went test optional in 2007, that was one of the arguments. This isn't, you know, like a student acing the SAT is still not going to be successful if they're not able to successfully navigate pre-calc. And, you know, we don't require calculus, but for a place that is so focused on mathematics, you know, to think the SAT is a strong, you know, standard bearer or measurement is a little bit off. But I think so often the SAT or the ACT serve as sort of a proxy in the mind of folks for what is it the College Board says, academic and career success, whatever that means. But you know, so I think it's interesting because I think that, you know, students and parents listening to this, some of the things they hear from us that may not jive with what they remember for parents or what they're hearing, you know, what they're seeing in those Facebook groups or what they're hearing, you know, as they talk to others going through this process. And so I kind of want to throw out 3 facts, and if anyone disagrees, feel free to. But this sort of is the underlying tenet behind why I think so many schools are now test optional, and were even before the pandemic. And you know, it's so fundamental. Number one, standardized test scores have longstanding problematic correlations with family income, with race and ethnicity, and with gender. And so right out of the gate, that's pretty problematic. If you're trying to come up with a process for evaluating students, you typically don't want to lean hard on something that either is introducing or reinforcing any type of systemic bias. And so that's one fact I want to share. Second, and this has played out during the pandemic, even for schools that reluctantly adopted test optional admissions policies, admissions professionals can make excellent decisions without standardized test scores. I would argue they can make even better decisions because they have to drill down into the context, as Alicia was referring to in one of her comments earlier. And the final piece, and this is something that a research from Lee's predecessor, Bill Hiss from Bates, there's a 2014 study called Defining Promise that looked at the results of like 133,000 students who had graduated from schools that had test optional admissions policies and looked at, test submitters versus non-submitters. And that aligned with what we've seen at WPI with, 13 years or so of data. It's that there is virtually no difference between submitters and non-submitters when it comes to the core aspects of academic success. So retention and graduation. And so, like that right there for me lays out the case for admissions professionals to say, okay, it might introduce bias. We don't actually need it. Oh, and it doesn't actually predict what people think it predicts. If we were to start this from scratch and I were to tell you those three things, would you ever introduce SATs or ACTs into the process? I don't think so. And so I start off there just because I think that there is some reasonable skepticism about test optional, about what it means, and about how this could possibly be the case when, parents went through a process where this was the end all be all. And we heard this was so important to success. And so I think that it's important to sort of underline the landscape there. And I'll pause to see if anyone disagrees with any of the 3 points that I made there.
I want to throw in an additional stat.
Go for it.
Using College Board and ACT's own research, their justification for their test is it adds 3 to 8% prediction of first-year GPA.
Yep.
Right? Let's take that. Let's accept that. Let's accept that College Board and ACT aren't juking the stats at all. Would you encourage a $2 billion test prep industry and a second $2 billion testing industry to get 3% better of freshman grades? Why? Who would pay for, why would you pay for that? It just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Maybe,
so
can I just piggyback off of that?
Yeah.
Akil's comment, and to tie it back to some of the research you referenced, Andrew, just to maybe at a smaller scale, add some data. So we continue to keep our own internal data at Bates. So every first year class, we then map both those who submitted tests and those who did not, to then see what their ultimate Bates GPA is. So it's a Bates GPA, one of many, as you said, Andrew, measures of supposed academic success. And there is less than 1/10 of a point difference in their Bates GPA, test submitters versus non-test submitters. So in terms of having confidence in our assessment process as admission professionals to determine who, regardless of whether or not the scores are there, is prepared and ready to hit the ground running and do the work, and for us to support them regardless, again, of those scores, it's not at all something that we spend our time spinning our wheels on.
So Akil, maybe you can quantify this for us. For this cycle, the class of 2022, roughly, ballpark, what percentage of schools, four-year schools, are test optional?
I think it is 75, somewhere between 75 and 80.
So
darn near all of them.
The vast majority. And so it's still important to make sure that your schools are among those and to see how standards change. But I think there's some consensus that the toothpaste is not going back in the tube, that for most institutions, this is about progressing to, an evolution in the college admissions process. But
unless you're in Florida or Georgia.
Unless you're in Florida or Georgia, yes.
And that's with all things education, if you're in Florida. I don't know.
And Akil is referencing the fact that the state boards are dictating admissions policy to those public universities in ways that sort of run counter to the rest of the country. But I think there's a lot of questions about, okay, this is the landscape now. Schools are test optional. What does that mean? Okay, you can make good decisions. How? How does that play out, Lee? What does that look like when you're reviewing students in an admissions committee? And I know it's never like this, but one has test scores and one doesn't. Or how do you talk about these students in ways that are equitable?
Sure. So I want to just clarify, I'm speaking for Bates. So I'm not speaking for all test optional institutions. And I always say this, even when doing an information session for Bates, just read the fine print, if you will, ask the tough questions. So any colleges, universities you're considering, ask them point blank, what is their test optional policy? What is their test free policy? What does that actually mean? If I'm a recruited athlete, what does that mean? If I'm seeking merit aid, what does that mean? Yada, yada. Bates, it's kind of cut and dry in that we're Division III, so we don't provide athletic scholarships. We also strictly provide need-based aid. So again, for Bates, it's pretty basic. Either you give us your scores or you don't. And when a student chooses to submit their scores, fine, that's their prerogative. They're sending a signal that for whatever reason, X, Y, or Z, they think these scores are somehow predictive, telling, reflective of their academic capability, or they're just plain proud of them. Or with all due respect, they might just not have fantastic counseling or resources at their high school, given the realities of day to day. And perhaps they applied not fully understanding what test optional meant. And they were just submitting applications across the board, press submit, and boom, Bates got their scores, which they can change after the fact, by the way. Nonetheless, so then the student that chooses not to submit their scores, we're like, hey, great. Also your prerogative. You're sending a clear signal to us that everything we need to know about you as a learner and you as a community member is fully illustrated in your application. And those scores are either something you're not proud of. I should back up. Those scores are something you might not even have. And this was even pre-pandemic, right? I always got excited when we saw the kid that was taking like the political stance and saying, I'm just not even taking that test because I don't believe in it. And they didn't even have the numbers to call on, right? So either they truly just didn't even take the test, or in the pandemic, they haven't had the access to the test, or they're really just not proud of them, or don't think we need to know them because we've got the content we need to see. So regardless of whether they send us those numbers or don't, we spend the absolute majority of our assessment on the transcript, the writing, and the recommendations to really understand who they are as a learner. We practice holistic admission, so it goes well beyond the academic profile and those elements of their application. And what I love to say, and I truly mean this, and it goes to something I think Alicia was alluding to earlier, for us at Bates, it's persistence and performance over time, right? So that transcript tells a story. And I now can no longer say this because it's like a 2-hour test in the new form that is to come. But I used to always say 3.5 hours on a Saturday versus 3.5 hours on a transcript, or 3.5 years on a transcript. I'm going to take those 3.5 years, right? Even if there were bumps along the way, that is going to tell us who you are as a learner, how we can imagine you taking advantage of opportunities, and then you couple that with your letters of recommendation, how you're going to participate and be a part of the vital classroom, right? So yeah, no, it doesn't come down to those who have scores, those who don't. And even for those who do submit them, we're sort of, again, like, hey, thanks for sharing. We'll take a peek, but we're moving on to the good stuff.
And so now I'll ask the college fair skeptic question. But if you have someone who has the test, you're going to go for that one, right? Or the other question we get is, well, my child didn't do as well, didn't work up to their achievement in high school, but they nailed the SAT, so that's going to overcome, right?
Au contraire. So no, what will happen in that instance is almost more worrisome, right? So back to the persistence and performance over time. I want the kid who's just working it out and maybe even getting, dare I say, B pluses, right? But they're taking rigorous courses and they're pushing themselves, because if you can show up on a Saturday morning, where have you been for 3.5 years?
Yep. And I see Alicia's muted, but I see her affirming knowingly. So I think, that's one of the things that it's important to also call out, that, this admissions isn't a prize to be won. And so if you have your sights set on a school and you hear that response from their dean or your admissions counselor, that's not failure. That's an opportunity to recalibrate your search, to go to, dare I suggest, your school counselor and to say, here's the feedback I heard. How would you advise me? And so I'm curious, Alicia, as you've seen such a dramatic increase in test optional schools, and you've heard all these questions, skepticism, you've helped students with those pivots. Tell us what it's like from the counselor perspective and how you advise students as they consider test optional institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I feel so passionately about this particular part of the process in particular because it is such a reflection of who the student has been for the last 3.5 years. And too often, students and families sort of isolate college admissions and that whole process to this one window of time where they can, join something like, let me make sure I got enough clubs, let me make sure that I took that service trip to the low income neighborhood, like let me make sure that I just tack on these last few things. And I'm thinking to myself, like, we have known you for 3.5 years, we know who you are, we know that honestly you know who you are. Parents, you know your student, right? And so we can look at your list and see the places that you're excited about. And also, please understand that there are many places for you just as you are. And so I can't drive that home enough. It's often what students and families are really surprised to hear. I'm not just going to co-sign a student wanting to go to all of these colleges and universities that may see their high school experience as something that does not align with their particular mission or the students that they typically admit. So often I see mismatching happening between students and the colleges that they have in mind, because again, working with teenagers, they tend to focus on the things that they are aware of. When my teen son opens the refrigerator, if he doesn't see the ketchup, he assumes that it's not there, right? Because he hasn't moved other things
In
the
defense of your son,
refrigerator
Alicia,
to
no.
see and
I was
find
gonna say
the
that
ketchup.
sounds like my husband, but we'll talk about your son.
Which I get, right? Like this is it's supposed to happen that way, right? It's what's in front of them that they need to deal with and they need to address. And so that's why there are adults around them to help them kind of dig a little deeper. And so that's essentially what we do with their college lists. And I love this part of it because I truly do believe that if a student has access and has some means and has some opportunity to attend a 4-year institution, if that's what they want, 2-year institution, if that's what they want and that's their path, there are so many places for them. And that within itself is exciting. I think of colleges as I'm meeting with students and I'm like, oh, you would be awesome on this campus, but you've never heard of this school, but I'm going to introduce it to you, right? And so I think as long as students and families are becoming more open to that, and realizing that it's a two-way street and it goes both ways. Students can be excited about certain colleges and universities for sure, but those colleges and universities also need to be excited about you and need to be excited about providing the supports and the things that students need. And so, nobody wants to set anybody else up to not be able to do well, right? None of us want that. And so I think being able to pivot and being able to take a second and third look at a list while being very honest about what the student has done in high school.
Enjoying the podcast? Like and subscribe to this YouTube video. You can also find us on the web at InsideAdmissionPodcast.com. And you can find and engage with us on social media, where our handle is Inside Admission on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Now, back to the pod. So let's pivot to the new SAT, the digital SAT, moving away from graphite and paper and into the 1990s. So Akil, tell us what we know about what the College Board has shared about the test so far, how it will be different, and to your point, how it in many ways it won't be the SAT.
It will be an SAT. which they all are. They all are, and SAT. So, all right, what do we know? We know that internationally in 2023, I believe March, the SAT will launch. The previous fall, the PSAT will launch some point before it. In domestically 2024 March, the SAT will launch. So 11th graders in the spring of 2024 will have to think about the digital tests. And I think no one should think about both tests. So those who are going to be 11th graders in 2024 just completely ignore the current test and only worry about the digital test if they worry about a test at all. So what do we know? We know that it's going to be delivered digitally via some downloadable app. One thing I find interesting, it sounds like the app is downloadable prior to the exam and used as practice. So you'll have an app, you'll download it to your device, you can play around with whatever practice material they release, and then day of you sign into the app and you take the real test, which is intriguing because, like, I wish I was a hacker now because I'm going to be up in there, but that's a whole different story.
Well, I'm thinking about my students at WPI and how, quickly they could hack a registration
Hook me
system
up with one or two. It just sounds like something fun to play with, which is just terrible to say, but like, okay. So anyway, there's an app, you download it to your device. It'll be workable on laptops, on Chromebooks, and on tablets is what they say. I'm still trying to dig into, does that mean desktop? Because I'm on a desktop right now, right? So I'm like, does that mean desktops won't work? I guess that's a little bizarre. Like most schools have desktops, not laptops available. Like, so there's some of the tech things which will be interesting to find out. But you download the digital thing. It's a 2-hour test instead of a 3 and change hour test. It is shorter. There is shorter reading comprehension. Currently, reading comprehension passages are about 800 words. Knowing what I know about 3 SAT versions ago when they had short reading passages as well as long, my guess is that those passages are going to go down to somewhere around 70 words, right? And have one question per. So reading comp will be changed entirely in the nature of it. You're now reading a paragraph instead of a passage, right? But it's completely comparable. So let's see, what else do we know?
Sounds a little skeptical, Akil.
I mean, it's weird, right? Like, we take a 3-hour paper-based test with long reading comprehension. We turn it into a 2-hour digital test with short reading comprehension, but it's on the 400 to 1600 scale, so it's all good, right? And that's what they're selling to colleges, right? It's like, hey, we still put it like, so, if, I don't know, it's bizarre to me. So, but it's shorter reading comprehension. They say it's going to test the same things, but if it's 2 hours instead of 3, there has to be fewer questions. So with fewer questions, they're telling us they're testing the same content. I'm not sure the math works for me, but that's what they're saying. So it'll be a shorter test delivered on computer using adaptive technology, which I find is the interesting part of it. Because adaptive computerized testing basically says, let's use your initial performance. So if you're given a first set of 20 questions, if you get 50% of them right, you are now scoring in the medium range. The next section you get in math gives you medium level questions to fine tune that score in the medium range. So let's say you get the first 20 questions and you get 50% of them right. Then now the test has predicted you have a score range, let's say between 400 and 600. And it becomes really difficult to get out of that score range. It's only narrowing your performance in that score range, right? Not 400 to 600, if we're on the 200 to 800 number, right? So it now has narrowed the 200 to 800 to, let's say, 400 to 600, and then your next bit narrows the 400 to 600 further, right? That's essentially a simplification of the adaptive technology, but that's essentially what they're going to do with the test, which means kids who start slow might be at a bit of a disadvantage. Kids who are really methodical and may not get to as many of the questions might be at a bit of a disadvantage. Now, with all things, there are trade-offs. Some kids are going to do a whole lot better, right? Some kids are going to be at a disadvantage. I don't know the proportions of it. And so I have some concerns about especially the first people who do it until we find out more research on how well the test works. Test optional, baby. Test free. And once again, we're
Thanks,
saying
Akil.
all
Thanks
of this to get 3 percentage points prediction on freshman GPA and maybe 2 percentage point prediction on graduation rate. Seems like
well, and that's the interesting thing is that we won't even have the research to say how predictive these truly are. So, I think one of the things that fascinated me with the late January announcement by the College Board was, I think, almost like sales features. The test's going to be shorter. You're going to like it more. So, I mean, there is a bit of a sales aspect here. They're competing with the ACT for state
sales.
contracts and for
think about what they said.
For
they
individual.
Asked kids, do you prefer the 3-hour test or the 2-hour test? And they're like, look, 84% of kids
Shocking.
like the 2-hour test. Like, really now? Like, you're asking me, do I like broccoli or ice cream?
Market research is important, Akil. So I think one of the challenges we have here is that we're hearing from the College Board, this is going to reduce anxiety. It's going to be easier. If you're in that class of 2025, or if you have a child in that class of 2025, Alicia, is that reducing the stress and anxiety for these students and their families? Next question. Yeah.
Short answer, no. Because now they're going to be confused about how it's going to be used, what it means, what colleges have it to compare it to. So they're going to have a ton of questions and a ton of reservations. So my hope is that I will continue to be a high school counselor for multiple years. And so what I plan on telling the class of 2025 is to, if you can, apply.
And we spent a lot of time working up to the digital SAT because I think there's only so much that's known about it now. But I think Akil's given us a good breakdown.
Right.
But I think that the conversation leading up to this point has provided an essential foundation for students and families navigating this process, especially if it's their first time, to really understand what's at play here. And so, Alicia, you jumped right to my next question, which was really, like for these families who are hearing this, who are hearing, geez, we just finished middle school, started high school in a global pandemic. Now the SAT is changing. I mean, college admissions was stressful enough for these students and for their parents. How are we advising them?
Yep.
And Lee, from the college side, as you think about, okay, we're going to get these new test scores, and we don't have any research into the validity of these scores or how they correlate or don't with past scores. And you see this anxiety, how are you approaching this, as
Sure.
Bates?
Yeah. And again, just hearing Alicia talk about it from her perspective, I'm thinking about my staff asking, okay, well, what does the scoring mean? And how does that sit vis-a-vis previous scores? And can we do any sort of correlation analysis? I'm not going to spend our resources doing that, right? What's more important is trying to understand, let's talk about mental health. Let's talk about what the high school setting has actually been through the pandemic. I'm literally just got off the phone with an associate dean in our faculty's office, a dean of faculty's office, thinking about the first year experience and how are we scaffolding for their arrival to come in, given that these students have had a half, if not more, of their high school experience in a quote unquote not normal world, which is their norm. But yet we're still operating in some ways, perhaps, on what was 2018, 2019, right? So as I think about it from an admission perspective, to answer your question, Andrew, I don't want to say I'm turning a blind eye to it, but I'm just not spending a lot of brain power and resources and capacity to think about those numbers, because that's what I reduce them to. They're just numbers. Rather, how can we make sure that our holistic admission review process remains in such a way that is truly providing opportunity for students to fully express themselves and all that they have to offer, coupled with our ability to have confidence that they can come and do the work, whether they've had a myriad of opportunities or not, and not really fixating on the numbers as a part of that process. So I'm going to let it play out. We'll watch it from the sidelines, and we'll continue to focus our energy on the core of what is our work, which is understanding them as a full community member, full learner, and go from there.
Can I add to that, Andrew? Yeah, because I think it brought up a couple of really good points that, I would love to give like just anecdotal examples for. We have about 40 to 45 minutes to spend with each 11th grader in the spring semester. And that's covering pretty much everything that they want to talk about regarding this process. If I could take the 10 to 15 minutes that we spend over analyzing and figuring out what these standardized tests mean for these students and how they'll be used and whether or not it's a good score and looking up freshman profiles and all of this, if I could take those 10, 15 minutes and spend that time really focused on their wellness, how they're adjusting to all these new AP courses, which a lot of 11th graders sort of load up on in their third year, how they're sleeping, how they're eating, how they have learned certain habits that they want to carry with them, in a college experience, any programs or specific mental health resources, counseling resources, community resources that they're going to need, and exploring those. I would love to take those 10 and 15 minutes back for those students. And even for the questions that they come to the college fair with, they usually get 3 or 5 questions, right? That's usually about the amount of time that they have to spend with an admissions counselor because there are so many students, not many tables. And so which questions they pick, right? You can guess what they are right now. There are questions around the grades, there are questions around the courses, there are questions around the testing, right? Not necessarily the questions about how they are going to function on campus the way that they have been able to learn how to function at our school. And that's a problem. That's a problem, especially for these kids who are still living in this pandemic.
I think that's so true. And it brings me back to a moment that just has stuck with me for almost a year now, when I was presenting to our faculty about our proposal to eliminate the use of test scores altogether and go test blind. I had a faculty member stand up. He's, late 30s, early 40s. He came, he hopped on the Zoom screen and he said, he's like, I don't really have a question, just a comment. He's like, I'm a parent. I just finished this PhD process not too long ago, and that long slog, tests all along the way. As a parent of a 6-year-old, I'm sitting here and I'm voting for something that, in an ideal world, my 6-year-old would never have to worry about this test. They would never have to waste their time on test prep. And that just, I've been doing this for so long, and I'm a father of, an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 1.5-year-old. And I mean, yeah, I see the stress that students go through. I see the anxiety that, the well-intentioned parents who are like, I'm never going to be that parent. And we all know the people who we work with who then become that parent. And it doesn't necessarily change anything. And so, I just think about what a moment this is, with so many schools going test optional, with the SAT, making its latest change, that really, this doesn't mean a whole lot. And I think that that's something that's important for students and parents to hear from a former test prep expert, from a school counselor, from, college admissions deans. And I'm talking with some of my colleagues in Florida and in Georgia and in places that are still requiring this test. There are maybe 2 schools that I know of, and Akil will tell you on Twitter, I'm sure, who they are, that actually really do care about those test scores. And the rest of them, it's politics, whether it's a state board, whether it's a board of trustees, whether it's a president of faculty. We've all gone through this, and the college side, as we've gone to go test optional, is that there's always going to be some resistance to change. But the people in those admissions offices know about the problematic correlations with these test scores. They know they don't need them, and they know they don't really tell us a whole lot. And so even those places that are requiring these test scores, they are never as important as you think they are. And I just want to underscore that from the college side, is having worked at places that were requiring it, what you'll hear admissions officers say, if you listen closely, we de-emphasize the standardized test scores. The high school transcript is the most important part of our evaluation. They're trying to send you signals. They may not be able to tell you, we don't care about that test, but 9 times out of 10, even when you're trying to use the test score, it's affirming everything else we see in the profile, everything we see in the transcript, everything we see in your essay, in your recommendations. And so for the vast majority of students, even in a required setting, this test has almost no impact on your admissions decision. And so when I think about the outsized impact that it has on students, on their lives, on their free time, my plea is, if you're thinking about test prep, think about literally anything else you could do with that time, and then do that other thing. Because at the end of the day, there are so many other schools you could go to. There are test blind schools that won't even care if you took the test. There are test optional schools that probably don't care if you took the test. And then there are schools still requiring it that still won't care that much about it. And so I think that it's one of those things that has just this outsized influence and space in our minds. And we need to chip away at that power. And that's what I hope this conversation is doing for students and parents. But we're probably about 3 weeks away before folks in more affluent communities start to see the person who got a perfect score and went to Harvard, and they have a new online workshop where they'll tell you all the tricks about the digital SAT. And yet you're hearing from expert school counselor, admissions professionals, and test prep folks who are telling you, we don't really know. And so I would just say, as you think about weighing those possibilities of, do we lean into prepping for this test or really giving it a large mind share, or do we just say, you know what, it's one piece and it's not the most important piece, and work with your school counselor to come up with that balanced list. I hope people listening to this and people engaging with their school counselors will really hear this and believe it, because I think a lot of the times you hear us say these things, but I hope you see the authentic nature and passion that everyone on this podcast has about these things, is that these tests seem so important for such a short period of time, and then they're not, and they probably never were. And so I guess I want to start to wrap this up to see, as we think about students in either boat, whether they're one of the last students taking the new old SAT, current SAT, or the new SAT, digital SAT. What advice do you have for them?
To tie a few things together, the first thing I would say is, if you have to test, right? So if you have to test, then take the ACT for all the people who are facing the digital SAT. It's known. There's practice material up the wazoo. It's not changing. Just reduce the stress in the process by removing the variable, right? If you remove the variable,
David Coleman's calling me right now.
Right. If you remove the variable of the new tests, now you have the known quantity of the ACT. You don't have to worry about what's the prep material, all of that sort of stuff, right? Yep. I said there's also for families 3 questions to ask yourself. Should I prep? Is it worth it? Can I afford it? How much time? Blah, blah, blah. Then you can prep and decide should I test? You don't have to test. You can prep and choose not to test. So you just structure out these decisions. Should I prep? Should I test? And then should I submit? And these are all different decisions at different points in the process. So if you break these down to simple decisions along the way, you can make this a less stressful process, right? The other thing I would add is I loved your phrase of outsized influence. I think it's outsized perceived influence. And you have to do everything you can to reduce that outsized perceived influence. Yeah, there are places that care about it, probably not as much as you think. You know, if you are a person who really is proud of your score and you really want that to matter, like you're a person who probably hates test optional because you want the score to, like, I want colleges to admit Black people who wear glasses. I think that that's important in determining intelligence, right? Because I think that that's a really important factor. And I'm going to be pissed if people don't admit and prefer Black people with glasses, preferably Black people between 5'11 and 6'1". Right. So like I think we all like certain things, you know, that benefit us. But we have to realize that that's not always what should be considered. Right. And I think that once we sort of de-emphasize some of those things, we realize that maybe if the SAT should have a role here, it should probably be equivalent to all the other optional things like extracurriculars and the service trip to Peru and all of those other things that we know are maybe going to help, but largely irrelevant. And like, that probably is about the strength the SAT should have ever had. Right. And I think once we reduce the outside influence of it, then things get a little bit more normal. And so I think the goal in this process should be to reduce that stress, reduce the crazy around it. And a lot of that stems from focusing on one institution, especially a highly rejective school. You know, and if we change that up a little bit, it'll get better.
That's sound advice. Thanks, Akil. Lee, what would you say to students and or parents?
Sure. So I think building off of something you said earlier, Andrew, I would just really think about it from a sense of time and time spent in all of the ways that Akil just outlined. So for a student, it's hard to do this, but take that moment and step back and think about, you know, high school is a finite period within your life. And how much do you wish to devote to the test prep, the actual test taking, and then the test submission? And I think just make a choice. I would vote for the choice of reducing that, if not entirely to zero, but to reduce that so that you're spending your time elsewhere. Then at that point, when you ultimately get to submitting college applications, to think about your application as a full storyline and really think about the minimal role the testing takes and make sure you're emphasizing across your application, your full storyline. I think it'll be a reminder. Hopefully it's not too late of a reminder that you shouldn't have spent as much time on the test scores, and you'll be affirmed that you spent your energies doing the things that mean the most to you, whether quote unquote well or not, but you were fulfilling yourself there. And without wanting to throw in a total wild card at the very end of this, for the families, I would say take this time, supporting your student in all those other endeavors, but take this time and actually really look into financial aid. I think about how many people show up late to the game there, and those applications aren't complete. A full-blown understanding of that glossary of terms and myriad of opportunities is not complete. No fault of theirs, but because this is such an industry, there's so much time on a family's part spent agonizing over their child's testing, where they could have spent a fraction of that time and better positioned their student and their family financially. So again, didn't want to throw a wild card in, but if a family could supplement testing neuroses and put that towards financial aid education, that would be my vote.
Really, really great point, Lee. Thank you for that. And the last thing I'll say is that so often, you know, and I started a podcast on this premise, so shame on me, but I'm also trying to include school counselors and folks like Akil and others who have expertise. But so often families automatically give just such a high level of respect for college admissions officers and whatever, you know, a first-year member of our staff says at a college fair is ingrained in their brain. And then when they go in to talk to Alicia, well, the college said this, and there's almost if not a lack of respect, maybe a lack of appreciation for how much expertise and how much knowledge, how much more knowledge school counselors have about this process than admissions counselors who often see it through the 1, 2, 3 universities that they've worked at. So that's my cue. If you haven't been listening the past few minutes, perk up, listen, because Alicia is going to bring us home with some sound advice that she would give to students and parents who are navigating this process right now.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. I'm definitely feeling the love for high school counselors. So that is much needed. Thank you. So yeah, I would say, ultimately, of course, Georgia and Florida are going to be exceptions with this, but if you can avoid sacrificing yourself, don't sacrifice yourself for this exam. And I see students do it every year, and I see well-intentioned parents, pushing their students through sacrificing themselves every year, sacrificing sleep, sacrificing schoolwork, sacrificing time with family, with friends, sacrificing volunteer work, sacrificing work, employment, sacrificing a lot to do well on this exam. And so, if you have to take it, like Akil said, be strategic about that and build that out in a way that is still healthy. And I think that's, especially important now as we're trying to navigate this pandemic, wearing masks, washing hands, keeping distance, staying outside, all of these sorts of things. It just magnifies that concern that I have for a lot of high schoolers right now. Also, it's important to, like Lee said earlier, in terms of that balanced list, that can make up for a lot of strife and difficulty. If your list is balanced, then you should be good. There are colleges and universities that will admit you and that will be excited to have you on campus, even with those C's, right? The balanced list is personalized, it's individualistic, it's specific to your academic profile and the things that you want as a student in your experience. Ultimately, I really, really want students and families to, especially students, to feel empowered in this process. This is not just about you trying to be perfect for a college to see you and admit you, right? This is also very much about you getting the option to bring your greatness into a particular community, right? Students should feel empowered in this process because they've done good work in high school. They've done some work. Maybe they've done a little work. Either way, there is an institution that will be happy to have you on their campus. It's just a matter of making sure that you find those institutions through proper research. Rely on your school counselor. Our responsibility and our job is to make sure that we know about hundreds and thousands of colleges throughout the country. We know about the students in previous years who have been admitted and trends that we see within our high school. We know where many of our students go. We know where many of our students graduate. We know which colleges and universities give our students fantastic financial aid packages. We keep track of all of this as school counselors so we can help make those informed decisions alongside our students. So I really want students to walk away from this conversation feeling empowered that you can be on a campus, you will be admitted to a college. It's about doing the research, having a balanced list, knowing who you are and being honest about who you are as a person and a student, and collaborating with your school counselor if you have one.
Incredible advice, Alicia. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this special edition of the Inside Admission podcast.